I think I asked him, what did you learn from them? And I think, if I have this right, is he said, well, a lot of it was just sort of a non-verbal communication. It's in a bit of a gray area, whether it was actually this coming from him, or is it coming from within, or is it coming from without, via their agency. But he did say that at one point he was in the study of, I presume it was, I don't know, his university studies or something, and he was reading Chomsky and different political and geopolitical books. I think he said, what's this effect? And they kind of looked at this, and they related to him, why do you make it so complicated? Now, is that correct? Did he say that?
I had occasion to go back and listen to the first hour of what we talked about, and heard the whole time from when I began to like the terminus, wherever that was, when I was so drunk that I wasn't even conscious anymore, and hearing you guys trying to continue a conversation while I'm screaming in the background.
Yeah.
I thought you're both very, very kind-natured and generous souls to have betrayed very little sign of irritation with it, because I'm listening to it, I'm like, oh my God. And I was physically exhausted from the whole Pompeii adventure the day before, and I had prior to that taken a good 2 to 3 weeks off drinking. So when I started hitting the G&T when we started that conversation, it just hit me. I was gone. The conversation.
No, I honestly, I didn't notice. I was very drunk at that stage too. So.
Well, you sounded much better equipped than I did. I'm surprised you say that. I can imagine from the recording that you'd had a beer or two, but the recording itself lasted 90 minutes, and I could only bring myself the other day and listen to maybe the first 60 or 70 minutes, because the bulk of the conversation was located there, and I was so fucking drunk. I just kept yelling shit and everything.
I know. You see, this is something I find interesting too, is that there was in reading that chapter of Lacan's, and he's talking about the problem in psychotherapy, where the psychotherapist is simply not listening. Is the argument that they are engaged in a number of routines they're hiding from themselves, where they're just simply drawing information to sustain, self-imagery. And of course, this reminds me very much of, as I mentioned, Gurdjieff. There's a big part of these group exercises you do is to watch conversation, watch yourself in conversation, watch what games you're playing, and watch the extent to which you lie and everyone else is lying. And you see all these things. But it did make me think of the fact that you were recording these conversations. And that, I thought it quite the exercise that when you said, well, what the hell do I do with this stuff? And I had to say, look, you do it exactly as you will. Because in a way, the automatic reaction of mine would be, well, look, okay, we talk things over once, have a think about it, and then we'll just redraft it. We'll go over it again, but a bit more, a bit tighter and what have you. So this whole exercise, in a way, for me, it sort of brutally exposes myself to myself, which, it made me smile. And Christ, and when you're drinking on top of that, I honestly, I'd wake up the next day, I would just dimly recall what we talked about. And the thing is about our conversation, I kind of kicked myself, because I was very, very, very interested, because obviously he's a smart guy. He's not bullshitting. He's just talking to two guys, in a private conversation. There's no fucking agenda here to pass himself off as in a mystery from higher forces. And, I thought he had some interesting things to say. I thought his experience was very interesting. But the one thing, it only struck me the next day when I was sat here at the desk. I had a paper in front of me as we were talking and fucking drinking. And I'd scribbled down, he mentioned the tarot cards that had been put in front of him. Yeah, Lover's Strength, Prince of Wands or something like this. From some, I think, can't remember which deck it was, the Waitley deck or something.
One of them was the Rider-Waite and the different
Yeah,
Crowley deck and yeah.
Right, and they didn't use the Marseille deck that he had.
Yeah.
Is that correct? Well, the thought did strike me that, maybe it means absolutely nothing. The cards is just complete, they mean nothing in and of themselves. And that was when I just looked at what I wrote down, the next day, in a way that what they said of his own consideration for the world, it's just quite complicated. In the same way, maybe, they're looking at his own spiritual process and saying, well, why are you complicating it? With various decks. And, you mentioned, like, you sound like, a very sort of earnest spiritual seeker as they are. You end up looking at a whole lot of things, getting involved in a whole lot of things. And it just in a way sort of struck me as of a piece. Why are you complicating it? It's simpler than that. And, and then that's time. Then in my mind, that sort of fed into what we're saying about maybe the breakdown of the ego, which which all roundabout ways. So also getting at is what I thought would be worth kind of talking about is that Wilber has this distinction. He tries to explain the difference between sort of the Western approaches, psychological and psychoanalytic approaches, and the Eastern spiritual traditions. And he makes the point, he says, on its face, they seem to be doing similar things. They're addressing themselves to human suffering. And he distinguishes between approaches which are trying to have people awaken from the dream of material existence, and those approaches which are trying to ensure the dream doesn't turn into a nightmare. And I thought that was a quite neat distinction. And I thought then, well, there's something else that in our conversations I've sort of wrestled to understand is this issue of integration or non-integration, as the case is, of where people have sightings and knowledge and experience, and it just doesn't seem to feed into the rest of their being. It seems to be this isolated element that leaves the rest undisturbed. And I wonder too, then, is there a way of sort of considering this, within from that Eastern and Western approach? Okay, to what extent does this information force an awakening? And to what extent is that information trying to ensure that the dream, remains, or the dream doesn't become a nightmare? And you can see sort of the Disclosure Project fitting in there, somewhere like that. But then, in the former case, I'm thinking more of sort of the work of John Mack, where he makes much that point that there is an effort to awaken by setting, he refers to the Zen Buddhist concept of mondo. So, as you can tell, I mean, I'm confused on a whole lot of levels from what I remember, from what I think I can remember, but definitely stimulated to try and, put this into a schema too of against the bits and pieces I know of paths of inner development, and then to relate that to against the context of a world which, on its face, is really dying. At times it seems as if, are these UFO sightings, are these not like some sort of macro version of how when some people are dying, they begin to see spirits, and, they already have one foot in the next world.
That's an interesting idea.
Yeah. Is that what we, if you just, again, the mind is a collective piece, and some of us are seeing these things, and is this really, is this it in a way? So, there's a lot there for me, and I just don't know how to put it all together. I tend to end up when I'm stuck like this. I just remember going back at previous points in my life, and I've sort of doubled down on these efforts, and they tend to come to nothing. But anyway, yeah.
Well, all right. Well, I would say I had to listen to what he was saying the other day because, I totally blacked out. Yeah, I was hitting gin and tonic with very little tonic pretty hard, and lost consciousness about halfway through. But if you're going to keep close to what he was saying that while he was studying economics and political science, he had this impression from these beings who were in his vicinity that economics and political science were a kind of proliferation of signifiers, a lot of endlessly complex arguments that he said seemed to be in the service of avoiding simplicity. So if you try to avoid what's simple and obvious, you end up with these discourses. Now, I can see how that kind of works, because if you look at academic discourse, it's always this kind of endless tactical repositioning where I say this, even though it's not exactly what I think is the case, but I say it for tactical or strategic reasons, and somebody else, in order to attack me, to defeat me, says that. And it's battle, in a sense. It's conflict, it's war. And the thesis I suggested to you, that the human state with a capital S, the state itself, was a recent phenomenon that really had its roots in agriculture, that the state was nothing more ultimately than this attempt to manage the relatively recent phenomenon of an abundance of resources. You know, when I said the state was a couple of assholes sitting on top of a pile of food, that, to my mind, when I was listening to what he was saying, struck me as kind of an effort to reach the simple. That you ignore all of these different kaleidoscopic varieties when you're embedded in the discourse, in the system, in the disputation, and you take a step out and see, what does it all have in common? What does it all really kind of stem from? Now, whether that thesis that the state is nothing more than a certain effective agriculture is accurate or not, you can put aside, but maybe it at least is similar to the more simple type of explanations that he was evidently encouraged to find and that they perceive as being sound.
Yeah. You know, in a way, it reminds me of within the Gurdjieff work, a large part of your efforts are to accumulating observations about yourself. And these are, hopefully, the plan is, it's hoped that these observations are drawn from the state of self-remembering. So they tend to be qualitatively different than what passes for everyday self-reflection. Ultimately, though, this process ends in identification of what's called chief feature. And this is really the fulcrum around which your personality revolves. There's some aspects, there's some neat formulation which captures your overwhelming, your dominating drive. Okay? And this just cuts through a huge amount of what would pass for, or this would simply, how do I put this? Refute. It just starkly refutes what would be that everyday commonplace consideration that people have in self-reflection. So people would sit down and they could whine and they could bullshit, and this happened to me and then that happened to me and I wanted this, and on and on and on. You know what I'm talking about, just how people talk about themselves. But there could be just some concept, some just idea. There's some insight that you can see that, certain people are fundamentally whores. And it can be that stark, a description or a martyr or something like this. And I thought in a way that this is similar to what maybe he was being advised to sort of think on the macro level. And then I do remember you making this point about the state, saying that essentially, in a way, if you like, just competing criminal enterprises in some way. And the more I sort of thought about that, the more, I thought, yeah, there's probably more truth in this than I'm allowing. In the same way with people can be summed up very quickly and powerfully once you're willing just to discard so much of the bullshit that comes with our enormous self-regard. In the same way you can do that on the collective level for states, governments, economies. You can sum things up and get right to the heart of things. And then you're left with a more useful, a useful conceptual framework. You can think about things more clearly, and not least of which you can have some sense of destiny and outcome. And then that just ties me back into the idea, if you were looking at our world, and you don't sort of beam yourself down into your nearest department of sociology anywhere, and you're just looking at the world in terms of energies and energy use, and you could listen to communications, you'd pick up this as a disparate, fractured culture. You would see that these are people. This is sort of a species now facing problems it just cannot solve at this level of organization. As such, the problems will overwhelm them. And so then that made me think of the visitors and how the aliens or extraterrestrials, how they're purposed. If they're facing something which is to them maybe starkly terminal, like how do you relate to the dying? And I wonder, these sightings given, like to this astronomer in the Northern Territory I was talking about, or this pilot I knew. I wonder what that is for someone who's dying, and why would they do this? Why would they position themselves at times and switch on the lights, or they do these flybys, and put on displays? And then I wonder too, whereas if we can't see an effect on the conscious level, well, are there other effects in the individual we're just not seeing?
I'm sure there are. In fact, given the way things stand, I wouldn't be surprised if the majority of the effects are effects that we simply don't see. The better part of what people are is invisible. The simple fact that we are here in a sort of now, that we provisionally suppose exists, present, and yet we're also in some way the result of a past which is even bigger than the now, according to our definitions, means that the better part of who we are is not present and accountable. It's not visible. You meet someone on the street. Who is that person? Well, if the person's 30 years old, for example, presumably that person has 30 years of life experience. And how much of that do you encounter when you meet the person on the street? Well, next to nothing. You experience or observe only a surface. So only as simply a trivial definition that's so, before you even take into account the various esoteric aspects.
But there seems to be a great disproportion between the effort expended by the aliens at time and any noticeable effect over time. Just to go back to this sort of sightings people have had, these craft stop. They spend time doing things with people. The people record this experience. They remember it. Now, you're saying, yeah, okay, there are whole parts of ourselves that are inaccessible to our conscious awareness at any given point in time. But ultimately, do you not think that those experiences would begin to feed into the person and begin shaping their behavior, at least over time?
Well, it's more a question about what is recognizable than what is actual. If you're talking about how a person might be affected, or what kind of, if you feed a certain type of experience into a person, what the outcome will be, you're talking about observable outcomes. You're talking about what can be perceived. You've got all these people running around who say, well, all this shit was downloaded into my head, all this information, and, advanced, complicated physics formulas, and then the aliens told me, oh, well, you'll understand it when the time is right. Well, what does that even mean? I doubt, in a sense, that really the reason why they're giving this information is because at some future moment it will become necessary. Because how many of these assholes who are abducted will be right on hand when, for example, a complicated physics formula needs to be solved?
Right. Yeah.
It won't be. So you think then that perhaps there's a different kind of relationship between the information that's put into their deep minds and its expression somehow. You begin to think that there's some sort of very indirect influence, even though it's described to them as having a direct bearing on the world and so on. Really, the effect is meant to be indirect. And if that's the case, then you can see that as being consistent with the fact that you've got so many thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of people being abducted and given this information which doesn't exist anywhere really in the social sphere, but maybe on the sheer fact that there are hundreds of thousands of people who have been slightly nudged on account of this information they've been given but cannot access, maybe there is a slightly decisive impact. It's the same thing even in those cases where, I mean, I know of at least one case, the name I can't recall, but I know clearly enough about the case where somebody reproduces supposedly complicated formulas from physics. And they say, oh, well, here's someone who has no physics background, no college education, yet here they are producing these complicated formulas from physics, and yet at the same time, the physics produced were not unknown.
Romanek, isn't it?
Who?
Stan Romanek.
There you go. Yeah, I think that's probably the name. The guy who's since been
done for
arrested
child
for kiddie porn.
Yeah.
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 No telling what that even indicates. But the fact that he would produce these formulas, let's suppose that he's not an overt fraud. Let's suppose that the formulas he reproduced were the ones he was able to, without trying to pretend or fake or anything. Isn't it convenient that the ones he would produce were the ones that were more or less intelligible,
right,
according to a current state of knowledge?
Yeah, exactly. And that's, to me, obviously to anyone looking at that, that's kind of a surefire or a red flag. There's nothing novel there. I remember once I saw there was a British documentary on crop circles, and there was a mathematician talking about it, and he said what was interesting was to find, I think it was the proof for theorem that had not been developed in the study of mathematics.
I remember that. Yeah. Some sort of proof that was not present in Euclid for something.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I can't quite recall the point, but I remember being terribly impressed by it. And equally, just getting back to something, just to what had said about this, about the complication, that to me is it's one of those remarks which if I was just hearing this or reading this to me would strike me as a true account, because he's been told something that really runs right against all his intuition and intelligence. I assume, if he's sitting there studying these things, what he thinks there's great value in this. But here he is, he's reporting something that really contradicts powerfully what he thinks he knows. And in a way, it's an interesting, it's a new take, or it contradicts what we take as a given about a lot of the social sciences, that there is value in their ever greater complexity. What people would take is it's ever greater complexity, but no, the advice runs against the face of that. Likewise, I know I've mentioned it before with Billy Meyer, very, an interesting case. I'm suspicious of him because of the spiritual teaching he produced. Honestly, it's something. If you give them a laptop and a couple of $1,000 in a few weeks, they could come up with themselves. It's not, there's nothing really phenomenal in there, and nothing particularly new or exciting. Or there's no great insights there that you really can't find elsewhere. Just offhand in all your studies, can you think, like, how many times have you come across something that was genuinely new? You thought, well, this is actually a new insight or a genuinely new idea to you?
Well, I think at all sorts of different times, but at least in line with what we're talking about, I thought that a lot of the things in the key were genuinely new in my ignorance, you know? So it's true that truth is normally taken to include spontaneity, novelty. One of the aspects or attributes of truth is that it's new. When something you hear is new, that adds a lot to your acceptance of it as being truthful. But it's not always so.
Sure, yeah, but I mean primarily as an indicator of the sincerity or the truthfulness of the person making the report.
Well, almost always.
It's
I mean,
quite.
if someone is really impassioned, but they're telling you something that's exactly like something you've heard before, down to the nitty gritty, base sense level of it, well, then the fact that it's such a consistent imitation of something you've heard before makes you think, well, this person's full of it. But if someone's sincere and yet what they say doesn't seem to be derivable from anything else, you think, oh shit, there's something to this. Whether it's an ordinary, banal type of contact account or whether it's something like the key. If somebody is sincere and impassioned, and on top of that, it seems to have nothing related to, because human beings imitate, people reflect each other, they imitate, they derive from each other. You can see the kind of steps of transformation from one claim to another. There's no science of it, but and at best it might be called an art. But if you're an everyday human being, you can kind of get a sense for what is made up bullshit and what is not. So when someone seems to be totally sincere and they say something which seems totally new and isn't derived from their social milieu or from major cultural landmarks, that sort of thing, well, then it's significant. What he was talking about, I mean, I was less inclined to see it as extraordinary. I saw it more as simply being sensible, because so much of academic discourse and even scientific discourse is precisely that. It's all bullshit. I mean, if you look at it historically, the fact that most of what is produced is discarded is proof of that. If you go back and you look at, scientific journal articles from 50 years ago, there are very few that have a bearing on scientific discourse today. It's not to say that everything that was said was totally false, but that it just didn't figure into it. It wasn't significant enough, and so on and so forth. So the majority of what is produced at any given moment is bullshit. It's random nonsense.
But that's, with all due respect, but that would be something you'd understand given your education and background. But for the vast majority of people, even your audiences of quality newspapers, quality media, they would hold the academic process in great esteem.
Well, the reasons why they might hold it in esteem in a way are separate.
No, but what I'm saying is, given that, then their comment that, why complicate things is particularly impressive. Like your view is, yeah, sure, it's not particularly, it doesn't strike you as, particularly impressive, because you've quite a familiarity with a number of academic fields, and you can see a lot of the bullshit up close for what it is. But for a lot of people, it would still be quite an impressive insight, or an impressive argument, or an unusual argument rather.
Well, yes, but I mean, I would say look at the relationship between news and events. If you look at news from 50 years ago or 100 years ago, in relation to what we know, quote unquote, about events now, you again and again come to the conclusion that the news being produced at a particular moment is totally driven by agendas and people trying to take strategic stances vis-a-vis this or that, and the people who are totally motivated by a sort of prevailing popular paradigm. The events through what we call empirical analysis have since come out because they are only because they are less, I don't know, there are fewer stakes involved today. Like, it's only been in the last 20 years or so that it has become established that the so-called Gulf of Tonkin incident, which is actually a collection of incidents, were more or less misrepresented and even fabricated by the Johnson administration in order to justify going to war in Vietnam. It's non-controversial at this point. It's not loudly trumpeted, but it's well known that, the so-called Gulf of Tonkin incident, where in some North Vietnamese ship shot and fired on a U.S. Navy vessel, the whole story was false, and it was even known to be false at the time. There was some sort of strange accident or misinterpretation, and there was actually not just one event, but a couple. But then it was, used, it was seized upon, misrepresented, and then became, quote unquote, history for a time. And if you look at news and history and so on over the past 100 years or more, it's full of that sort of thing. Now, I'm using that as a kind of analogy because that's easier to accept, but it's the same thing when it comes to not only scientific truth, but academic progress. You have these accounts, these stories that are published that at the moment, blind history and admired as we are in our own present, we think, well, because this is kind of like the pinnacle, this is the apex, this is the absolute avant-garde of knowledge, that it has a closer relationship to truth. But that's not necessarily so. You could just the same decide that our present is as fooled by illusion as previous presents. And with good reason. When it comes to the news, you see it because you see a lot of the same strategic decision making. The New York Times, for example, always supporting the national security establishment and so on and so forth. Then when it comes to academic publications, whether it's scientific or social scientific, it's the same sort of thing. A lot of the hard science journal studies are bullshit. They simply reflect preconceptions. The evidence is falsified. The methodology is flawed. And when you get to the social sciences, it's just a lot of people who are trying to take implicit political stances against maybe the previous generation of research, or maybe against other people in the same field that they want to oppose. In that respect, the fact that so much of what is knowledge that we're trained to accept as being somehow reflective of truth and actuality, the fact that so much of knowledge is strategic and tactical, and it's really about human beings opposing other human beings, means that, to my mind, is at the heart of the reason why it's so complicated and so diffuse and so ridiculous, because it's not really about the essential truth of things, the simple truth of things. It's always about these endless strategic positionings and repositionings and flanking and out, which is like armies on the field. One army tries to outflank another army. They're constantly maneuvering. It's the same thing in academic discourse, scientific discourse. Seen from that perspective, what he might say about his impression of aliens saying, well, this is just all endlessly complicated and attempting to avoid the obvious. Well, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, definitely. I completely agree from that point of view, and moreover, then from for him, I suppose the implication is that it's a waste of time.
Well, it's hard to say, of course, what their perspective is. I would think, though, that there is a kind of very minimal progress involved in this ongoing human endeavor, whether it's the hard sciences or the social sciences. So yes, probably the vast majority of it's a waste of time, and the vast majority of it is spent in these kinds of endless social, knowledge as social practice dominates knowledge. But that isn't to say that necessarily everything obtained as knowledge is untrue.
Bro, I meant it from the point of view that if they are trying to awaken people from the dream, if that is the sort of truth they wish to bring to our lives, seeing them from that point of view, rather than have us in this dying stage try to perfect the dream or improve the dream, to try and have us awaken from the dream. It would be sort of a piece with what any number of spiritual teachers would say. Say, this is fundamentally pointless what you're doing. If for some great intellectual ambition, to say, well, this will bring you not one step closer to awakening or enlightenment.
Well, it could well be. It could be that they, on account of simply being different, have a slight inability to grasp what we've done, what we're doing. It could be for any number of reasons. It's hard to say. I would suspect that a lot of human gurus are simply people who have, for their own reasons, a desire to poo-poo other forms of knowledge, and therefore they've got a vested interest in saying, oh, you're just wasting your time. That could be, not necessarily the case in every instance. And it could be the case with them, or not.
Yeah.
At least it's undecidable.
And from listening to the recording, he said a few things. He said he was living in Long Island in this remote rural area, I take it. He lived near parks and forests. They wanted him to go out into these parks and forests, right? And he never went. Is that correct?
What he said was that he was in a particular town on Long Island, which compared to New York City is rural because you can go outside and see fields and so on, but ultimately it's not really rural. All of Long Island is absolutely settled, and there are cities and towns and so on. And what he indicated when we spoke was that they were asking him simply to go outside and even meditate in the backyard, which he was disinclined to do.
Okay.
They could take that for whatever it's worth. He was not in what I would call a remote area, having lived there myself. It's not like you're out in the middle of Arizona where it's 100 miles to the next town. I mean, it's literally 5 miles to the next town. But in comparison to New York City, where everything's pavement, you're out there where there's sand and beach and grass when you're further inland in the island.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. No, I was just, as I said, I was trying to recall because my memory was alcoholically enhanced at that stage, so things were just falling through the cracks. Yeah. Okay. Oh, sorry. I didn't actually realize I know you were automatically recording this, but I didn't imagine there's anything here for you to use. Yeah. All right. Well, listen. Look, I'm going to turn in. It's getting on, and I'm going to go to bed, but I'm more than happy to talk tomorrow evening or Saturday. I'm free Friday and Saturday, so I'll leave it up to you. I think what would be a good idea, I know you're struggling with editing and what have you, is really to just kind of just a couple of things just to return to and try and see can we get any mileage out of them. I'm also going to be away in Ireland for about 2.5 weeks. So,
oh,
yeah. So for me, it's I would just kind of like to really sort of summarize we sort of went all over the place in a lot of things and really attempt that second draft. So hopefully we do another recording. It will require far less editing and will not be, as I said, alcoholically enhanced.
Well, each
So
recording requires editing, but it's all right. I, at this rate, probably won't be up for anything tomorrow because I'll be so hungover. I'll be spending my time in bed,
sure,
and
yeah,
maybe Saturday I'll be recovered enough. I haven't gotten word from him yet about his availability. Maybe he doesn't know yet. If
sure,
he tells me, or if he, whatever, I'll let you know,
yeah, no
and
worries.
we can talk about whatever you guys want to talk about. I don't plan on being drunk on Saturday after the
Yeah,
shameful results of last week.
yeah,
So, we can do the best we can, but I'm waiting on him for an answer.
yeah. Well, I had it just in this stage of work. It's I just had a lot on, and then what was it, Wednesday night? Fuck, this one I know I have problems. Is that I thought I'd watch True Detective, this show.
Ah, yeah, season 2.
Yeah, yeah.
Did you see season 1?
What's that?
Did you see season 1?
Yeah, I did. I did.
Good.
I don't have a television, so I watched it off my laptop, and a friend ripped it off for me. And so I was just so fucked from work that I kind of broke up my rule and drank midweek. I thought, oh, I'll just have a bottle of wine. I'll drink it early in the evening, and being a bit of a hardened campaigner, I know how to manage things. So drink between 6 and 8. I'll drink water for a few hours, and then bang, I'll go to bed. Now my body will be none the wiser. Of course, what happens? I drink the bottle of wine. I virtually get fucking high on alcohol. It's It's not at all a depressant. I know I mentioned this before. And then of course, I give myself half an hour. And then what do? I go get some beer to
Nah.
fucking top it off. Fuck. So I drank a bottle of wine and 6 beers.
Oh.
Which is problematic enough. But the issue is I get up. I have to get up so early, and it's the sleep. It's the lack of sleep is the fucking killer.
Yeah.
And on top of that, it's when I do that, of course, it just does for my disciplines. I've tried to have this discipline of just exercising every morning, trying to aim for 2 hours plus meditation a day, and fuck, of course, that was out the window. I managed to get 90 minutes in today meditation and no exercise, but
No, I'm with you.
yeah,
I
yeah,
understand completely. You can imagine a table that has 4 legs, and then you try to imagine the same table with one leg.
yeah,
My brain is like the same table with like a tenth of a leg. And so when I get wasted anymore, it's nice and there's some mild euphoria the day it's happening, and it's usually driven by some sort of sense of desperation, um, desire for escape. But then the day after, well, I'll pass out and I'll get 4 hours of, I won't call it sleep, but I'll say unwakefulness. Because I'll wake up in a panic after 4 hours, totally unrested, thinking, oh shit, I'm awake. I'll wake up at 2 a.m. thinking it's 7 a.m. Like, oh yeah, great, it's morning. And I'll look at the clock, it's 2 a.m. Like, oh no, never get back to sleep. Totally fucked
yeah,
up, sleep deprived, unable to function the whole next day. And depending on the type of bender it is, I can go days and days and days with cognitive malfunction. Can't tie my shoes, can't figure out what day it is, have to sit there and think about this or that. Always the number of binge drink nights that I've had now over the past 10 years have taken such a toll that, a whole lot of basic cognitive ability is simply gone, which, was what I intended. I mean, I wanted to beat that shit down. I said, fuck this, eject. The way I always see it, like the fighter pilot in the jet, who all of a sudden just pulls that cord and ejects. I'll suddenly get this feeling like, boom, eject, I'm out. Same thing today.
Yeah.
It was about 1 p.m. local time, and I was like, no, I can't take it. Fuck it. I ran up to the grocery store to see if it was open. They were open. I ran in there like, Jim Beam, grab it, come back out. Wham, wham, wham. Eject. I'm out. Fuck it. It's done. It's the same whole thing. And then, each time, like, it takes its toll. Because even doing basic math now, if you wanted to give me like a basic algebra problem, I would just be totally ill-equipped. I wouldn't know shit.
Yeah,
it's
well,
awful. I'd hate to see a brain scan because, they'd scan my brain like, yeah, well, this is clearly the brain of like a 60-year-old pre-Alzheimer's patient. Like, wait a second. There's no question.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing is, I drink mineral water by the gallon to just sort of keep my body hydrated, to fucking stave these things off. But you made me laugh when you said, you said, well, I don't plan on getting drunk on Saturday. You're talking to one of the few people who actually is not startled by that remark, because I think exactly the same. I plan my, of course, sorry, I'm getting smashed that night. So yeah.
No, I'm not shocked at all. I chase everything I drink constantly with water. If I'm not mixing the drink with water, I'm chugging water. And yeah, I have for years now been totally unable to identify, maybe you're the same. I've been unable to understand the category of social drinking. People who will have a drink to have that mild euphoric release, or like, it's nighttime, so it's like time for all the Halloween spirits to come out, so it's a social get together. Fuck no. Like, if I want to get drunk, I'll wake up 10 a.m., start hitting the hard light, bam, knock it down. It's got nothing to do with nighttime. It's got nothing to do with social bullshit. And as far as it goes, people who go out and have a drink or 2 drinks, or maybe if they're really feeling wild, have 3 drinks, I can't understand at all. It's either for me, it's none or all.
Yeah.
I have no drinks, or I'm gonna really kill it. It's like one or the other. You either shoot yourself in the head or you don't.
Well, yeah. I mean, I the other thing, for a long time, I've only kept the only alcohol in the house is that which I'm going to drink within within hours. There's no way I can stockpile stuff here, because I start drinking and I'll just put a tremendous dent in what I have. And I find it just, it seems, as you know, there's a lot of, there's a lot of discussion about this and a lot of thoughts gone into it. And I'm like you, I don't get this 1 or 2 drinks thing. I just don't do it at all. In the same way that I don't like lunchtime drinking. People who will have a glass of wine at lunch. I don't do that. I even don't do that. I never drink at lunchtime, because you have to stop.
Yeah.
So okay, well, now we go back to work. I'm like, fuck, who wants to do that? It's once you break the seal, once you get going, well, fuck it, you get going. And
absolutely, amen. Yeah.
And the other part of it is, I wonder in a way, is it? I think you look at sort of stuff like Alcoholics Anonymous, or even the concept of alcoholism, and a huge amount of this just breeds guilt into people in obvious ways. But I just wonder, is it even just something the way my body's shaped? I just have. I find it, I find it euphoric. As you said, there is a genuine euphoria. There's a high off alcohol, and then and my body can sustain that high for hours. It's just, for a lot of people, yeah, they just get knocked down and pass out, and so for them, they can't become alcoholics. They don't have the physical capacity for it. Whereas I just know with my own body, I can just keep drinking and drinking and fucking drinking. And yeah, I suppose the one thing is, as I said before, I don't ever drink spirits. I don't really like them. I find that's too strong. But nonetheless, I mean, I have a personal reason for an interest in psychoanalysis, that the Western approaches, in all the years meditating, as there's been a lot of changes in my personality, that has never changed. That's one that's been strange for me. That never changed. Never changed. A lot of other things did change. A lot of growth and integration and mental health and improvements in social and personal function and the rest. All those good things. But the drinking, no, that stayed with me. The only time that sort of I kind of lose an interest in that is when I've really ramped up the meditation, where I'm becoming monastic. It's I work, get home, I meditate for an hour, I eat dinner, I meditate again, and do another hour, and then again. And you get up in the morning and do an hour before you go to work. That sort of effort. In that context, yeah, desire for alcohol has gone. And if I have drunk in that context, yeah, it's actually strangely what I would consider sensible drinking. Just like 4 or 5 beers, not 10,
Well, I would prefer not to drink spirits from time to time. The problem I have is that here in Italy, there's no good beer of any kind. I, if given a choice, would drink Belgian beer more than anything else. You give me a good monastic Trappist beer, I'll drink it again and again. They might be 9, 10, 11%. But here the beer is worse than piss. So on all those occasions when I would rather just have a nice cold beer, just like today, it's a warm day out. It's practically summertime here. I didn't want to get so drunk that I, ended up blacked out down the street like a few weeks ago. I thought, oh, it'd be nice to have a couple of good beers. No, you can't have any. So you have to buy vodka, gin, and there's nothing good to mix it with. So you're screwed. I ran down there to the store and, rather than look at all these other concoctions, I was like, well, just grab Jim Beam. Grab it. Come back. Now I'm drinking 40%.
Sure.
On a day when I would rather have just a couple of cold beers.
You mean the stuff's just not available? You just can't buy it.
No, and the beer they sell here, and it's like, the same reason why you wouldn't drink American beer, because it's piss.
Yeah, okay.
With a lot of carbonation in it. It's awful.
Yeah.
You can't even drink the Christ shit. I mean, it's awful.
Huh.
So even on those days where I don't want to get so hammered that I black out, I end up having to do so.
Yeah. Yeah.
I got but I tell you, I alluded to it. I want to tell you this at some point, so I'll tell you real quick. A couple of weeks back, I made the mistake of going to the pub down here. There's a pub in town, and they have some Belgian beer that they have a kind on tap I don't like, but it's probably about 11%. And that night I was there by myself. The girl's out of town. She's in the UK, so I'm stuck here alone, ready to, raise hell. I go down there and I get a couple of beers, and naturally the people are mediocre. They're assholes. Some of them look like criminals, so I start harassing everybody. That's what I do. And I'm, insisting that I talk to them and like trying to look at their smartphones while they're typing to see who they're typing to, making comments. It goes on and on and on. And I was there probably for a couple hours. At some point, I blacked out. And I have only the vaguest memory of leaving after I've been asked to leave. But I discovered that these two assholes were waiting for me around the corner trying to jump me. They knew I was drunk. So somebody threw me down. They either threw me down into the pavement or into like a brick wall. So I busted my head open, blood's going everywhere, head's hugely swollen, but I didn't really know it at the time because I was so fucking drunk. And when I left the place, I was quite satisfied because I thought, I harassed everybody. So I blacked out. The next thing I remember is that I'm on some strange country road. And there are these two Italian assholes across the street, like on the phone, and I had this really strong sense that I was being prevented from leaving. And the only thing I could conclude, based on my own personal experience, was that they're calling the cops on me. They thought I was a burglar, because obviously I'm a foreigner, so they're trying to have me arrested. So I kept standing there, And I'm in and out of consciousness, and eventually some cops show up, and then there's an ambulance, and I'm in the back of an ambulance. I'm like, why am I in the back of a fucking ambulance? And then my shirt's covered in blood and everything. I don't understand anything at all. Next thing I know, I'm in my apartment, and there are a couple of cops in here. I dig out an identity card, I'm laughing, I put my hat on, I'm walking around, they leave. Well, the way it all turns out is that just like so many ambulances, and you can Google this, there's an epidemic across the world of bedbugs in ambulances. So and I was probably only 200 meters down the street from my apartment, but I had no idea where I was. So they slowly, 5 miles an hour, back me up the street, and then somebody takes my keys. They see the address on the keys, and then all of a sudden I'm home again. But as a result of being in that ambulance for probably no more than 5 or 10 minutes, I bring bedbugs home. Now there's an infestation of fucking bedbugs in the apartment. They're crawling around the walls. They're in the dresser. And now I have this scar on my forehead where I've been jumped.
Oh, fuck.
What the fuck? So, I can't even leave the house and go get drunk. So I got to stay in the house. Try to keep myself from leaving the premises. Because this isn't the first time this sort of things happen. And now, I got to fight this weak infestation. Oh, it's just awful. But it is what there was an exact point, another precise point that slipped through my fingers about that story, relating to what you said before.
No, that's all right. No, it's I have naturally enough my share of alcohol-induced disasters. I'd say mine are typically more to do with ending up hitting on women and who either have boyfriends or married or unmarried, or and particularly at work functions. It's part of the course with these things. You wake up the next day and think, oh fuck. And I worked with a guy. He no joke. He would, before a function, he would go around and apologize to all female members of staff. He got a preemptive apology in, saying, "Look, you know and I know. I got a couple of drinks in me. Things are going to happen." And,
I do that by email. I understand it. Because what I've done historically now for a couple of years is I'll get on Facebook. I've had to close whole Facebook accounts because I get on there and just start saying every fucking type of shit you can imagine to people, messing with them, saying all sorts of crazy shit. I mean, I'll send chicks dick pics, right? And it'll be like of a big giant black dick, and the girl knows me. She knows I'm white. It doesn't make any difference. The most horrible things I can think of, I'll send, and the whole next day I wake up, I'm like, oh no, what the fuck did I do? Even today, there's this broad in the Czech Republic who wants to chat with me on Skype tonight. And I had to send her an email a couple hours ago, even before I started drinking. I'm like, well, listen, I apologize because number one, if I'm going to be sober, it's going to be boring for you because every other time we talked, I was drunk. But number two, if I'm drunk, let me apologize for that. Because you're not going to be saying all sorts of shit. You have to do that preemptive apology.
Yeah, it's so one of those things I'm now most comfortable getting smashed in private.
You have to.
Yeah, and strange thing too. All my girlfriends have not been drinkers. My ex-wife. She drank a little when we met, socially, but then she didn't drink ever, once in a while. Whereas I was obviously my marriage was disintegrating. I was drinking more and more. Then the last girl I lived with, she is same thing. She started drinking. She was drinking when we met, and then quit. I think I actually put them both off drinking.
Yeah, they withdraw.
Yeah, actually, I was like a warning against alcohol consumption, and but now I just find overall, if I were to be absolutely honest about it, is that I'm just, to be honest, so fucking depressed at the state of the world we're in. It's just it is fucking disintegrating around us in every way, and in ways I know I said this before. Like the problems that are in front of us are not particularly difficult to solve if there's any intention to do so. Then of course there are great things in this world and outside this world which no one's fucking interested in. So what I have to do is I find myself living a lie. Like I'm like some sort of homosexual in the closet. I would say I work with people who I'm on friendly terms with. They have no fucking idea who I am. Like they have no idea I'm interested in this sort of thing. In talking about extraterrestrials or religion or meditation.
Well, you can't integrate all this stuff. I mean, this is the problem. You cannot be the most of who you are anymore. You have to take the most of who you are and keep it, aside. It's, you're in the closet. You spend the better part of your days and the better part of your social interactions engaged in just a rear guard action to keep from either being fired or from being fucked with or all that kind of stuff. There's no question. I mean, I suffer from that myself. I mean, you are raised as a child and you come from the school system thinking, oh, you're supposed to be the best you can be, and that's who you are. But then as soon as you leave the school system and you're in the working world or anywhere else, you really have to hide the best of what you are, and you run the risk of being persuaded that it doesn't even fucking exist. Just to be instrumentally, you're just an instrument for who they are, what they want at a particular moment. You're constantly just giving them a very partial aspect until you forget that there's anything other than the partial aspect.
Yeah, I've seen this. I mean, it's one thing at work, you can put up a facade in that social setting. It's another thing, of course, in the context of a relationship. And I've had the same trajectory a few times. Is that one day there's a facade, and then over time, I kind of feel them out, and they're sort of sympathetic to certain things. But then what they discover, really to their horror, is the extent of my interest in these things. Like the meditation is just that's fucked up that is such a live wire. And of course, for women typically, they are, imminence is the feminine expression, isn't it? The women are in the world, they're about display, about being seen, they're tactile and more sensuous and the rest. And then something on meditation just strikes it. I think it rings a bell for so many of them. And then that became such a contentious thing.
Oh, they probably hate it because they all want you to be paying attention to them. And meditation seems to be a gesture that kind of like par excellence is just you arbitrarily withdrawing and not paying attention on purpose for no productive end. I can see where for some women it would drive them specifically nuts, that you'd be doing that on purpose.
And then I tell you, funny when I just broke up with my last girlfriend, it wasn't at all heated, and I was kind of happy for it to go because frankly it was getting in the way of my meditation. But she said, I used to with meditation, like I always do it on a timer, because otherwise I'll just get up after 3 minutes. So if I want to meditate for 45 minutes, I have to sit until I hear the bell. But then when I'm on my holidays, when I have an extensive break, I get 13 weeks holidays a year, then what I plan and work my days to actually maximize what I can put in. But then I'd set timers to remind myself to go meditate. And my girlfriend, she said she never forgets the time. I actually ended the conversation once the timer went, and for her that just fucking pissed. I can see why. I understand, but it's it's this question of integration, and honestly, I think what actually alcohol does is, I even noticed it when I was watching that True Detective season 2, is that most of the time, I don't own a television, but most of the time with sort of popular entertainment or things, I'm very much I can just leave it. I'm not that interested. It's just a stupid stupid story. But with alcohol sort of definitely shuts down certain parts of you. And I found myself really enjoying it. And that's what alcohol, I think, it tends to do. It's got this very grounding effect. You said, it's a bit like, it's pulling the cord and you jacked out of the jet. For me, it's sort of the analogy I'd have. It's that I've got my feet firmly in the soil and I'm enjoying it. Wherever I am, and I like it. Rather than sort of sitting there with this constant tension of, I shouldn't be doing this, is bullshit. There's things I have to do. I've a limited amount of time to do it. This hasn't helped me develop in any way whatsoever. So what alcohol does is just dissolves a whole lot of inner tension for me. But that tension, in part, it's my own messed upness, I suppose. But I mean, a lot of it's just the world. I mean, it's just experiencing the world.
Well, it makes good sense. Now, there's a grounding effect to alcohol, even with its euphoric aspects and so on. I mean, I have long felt that getting drunk gets me, in touch with my emotions. And the whole next day that you're in bed paralyzed, which is how I deal with it, I'm like, I don't know, becoming reacquainted with my emotions and so on in ways that I would not be if I spent 6 months sober, ruled by thought. So sure, I don't doubt that for a moment. It can be very grounding and relaxing and put you back in tune with things that are more fundamental.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting too, is that with what I notice is the effect with meditation. I think that when you meditate for a while, you actually, as pretentious as it sounds, your mind begins to change. How it functions, your sense of things, your feeling of experience, all that begins to change. And it's very marked when you've done it for a while, you've had a lot of momentum with no alcohol, and then you drink. And the difference between one day and the next can be, it's more than just a hangover. There's just this whole lot of loss. Which, of course, naturally I always regret, but it still doesn't stop me from drinking. But that's another thing.
Yeah, that I understand.
Yeah. Yeah, it was funny. I had, when I opened up my computer, I've been looking at this fucking Dylan Roof guy. I mean, this was in, Jesus, this guy. Now the thing this was something that got me, and I was just my eyes passing over it, and it seems all of a sudden, now this struck me as unusual. All of a sudden, there is a desire to take down this Confederate flag.
Yeah.
Which seems a lot of people are very quickly reversing or meant to be entrenched political positions. But I don't know, I'm looking at this from a big distance. So the flag's there. Now people are clamoring to take it down.
Well, I mean, the Confederate flag has nothing to do with it. What is really happening is that, at least in the US, but probably elsewhere, the media likes to reenact old narratives. So recently, for example, with all of the shootings and the police brutality, they've made it into a race thing. The fact is that as many white people in the US are being brutalized by police as black people. But it's an old narrative, the black brutality thing. It goes back to the early 90s with Rodney King and before. So instantly what they do is they ignore all of the police brutality against whites and the fact that the the police is being militarized thanks to all of the imperialism. No, they don't want to talk about that. They want to make it the old story, the familiar story. It's the same thing with this. 10 or 20 years ago in the US, there was all sorts of controversy about the Confederate flag, not even related to shootings. And I think in South Carolina, it may have even been the same state, there were different people who said, well, we need to take down that Confederate flag. For what? Well, it's a symbol of slavery and racism and so on. So this is an old story. It's an old narrative that they reinvigorate. And this is what they always fucking do. It's laziness and so on. And what can you say? I mean, it's appalling on so many levels that you can't even combat it.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
There's no telling if this guy is even really what they claim he is, because the fact is that every mass shooting you look at in the U.S. over the past 20 years, the shooter has, number one, he's been on all sorts of medication. It's always the same thing: Paxil, Prozac, you name it, all sorts of psychotropic drugs. And then there are always these little strange anomalies which make you think, well, maybe this guy was encouraged to do it somehow. Like in this latest case with this asshole, if you look at the guy, he looks like he could be anything between like 16, 24, 26. You can't tell the guy's age by looking at him. But in the very earliest APB, they're like, suspect is 21 years old. 21, exactly? Really? And then you find out the guy's 21 years old. So,
okay, yeah.
There's no telling what really went on. But as far as the Confederate flag thing goes, it's the same old type of shit. It's an old narrative that they recycle.
But yeah, I know, but it's interesting that some people tend to be responding to this. Like
everyone does, yeah.
Like I think it was Alabama. They're taking the flags all down, and it seemed to be such. I was struck by how weak that Republican governor is. How weak many of these Republicans are. I'm interpreting those sort of visceral, that basic, very primitive terms. But it just seemed that you're flying a flag out of some sort of principle, you would hope, it has some sort of meaning. Some idiot does something stupid. He didn't, he's a racist. I think he had a Confederate license plate or something like this. Then all of a sudden, that gets translated into a clamor to remove these flags. And you respond to it. Which, it struck me as bizarre. But, the thing with the anomalies with the shootings, what was that one in Connecticut, that terrible one with the school? Sandy Hook, was it?
Sure, yeah.
Jeez, do you ever read around that, some of the ideas, some of the questions that have been asked?
Yeah, a fair amount, yeah.
That's you'd have to look at. I found in looking at that, you're really sort of staring into the abyss.
Yeah.
If you've people who come together with a plan to shoot up and kill, 26 or 27 children, or if that even happened, you've all these issues. But I couldn't make any sense of it, to be honest with you. But do you think with this? Do you think it's directed towards gun control, or do you think this is just a way of creating a drama that absorbs energies that otherwise disrupt the actual governance of the United States?
Well, there's no telling about the intention. You can only talk about how it functions, the effects that it takes. And sure, it's another attempt to, in terms of the way it functions, to push gun control. It's also a kind of cultural war. There are lots of people in the South who respond to the Confederate flag as symbol. And probably a lot of those people have been raised in a tradition of racism or bigotry, but not all, probably. In any case, it seems to me whatever symbol exists, by being a symbol, can be given all sorts of meanings. The definition of a symbol is that, it's a pure representation. You can give it any meaning you want. the idea that it has only one meaning, and that meaning is sinful or horrible, and that we have to destroy the symbol, is absurd. But of course, that's what they're trying to do. So on the one hand, you have this sort of political push to eliminate the Confederate flag, because nobody on the political left in the United States uses the Confederate flag in their set of images, only the people on the political right. So the idea is, if you can destroy an image belonging to those on the political right, you somehow damage the political right. That's really the ultimate reason why it's happening in the mass culture. It's just another cheap, shitty mass psychology, political strategic ploy.
Sure. Yeah, okay. All right, listen, I'll leave it at that. Hopefully we'll talk Saturday.
All right. I will let you know as soon as I know what's happening,
Sure.
and we'll go from there.
Sure, all right. Talk then.
All right. Till then.
Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.